There was no greatness, no epic, no redemption, only isolation, denial, and ruin. The bunker became the perfect stage for collapse, a closed, dark space with no horizon, where absolute power ended up reduced to murmurs, hasty documents, and belated decisions. There died not only a man, but also the illusion of total control that had sustained the regime for years. In the end, the story of the bunker is not only the chronicle of a death, but of an absolute failure. The failure of an ideology that promised order and produced barbarism. The failure of a leadership that proclaimed itself infallible and ended up hidden underground. The failure of a regime that aspired to last 1,000 years and did not even outlive its own creator. Everything that had been presented as strength ended up revealing itself as extreme fragility. Remembering these events is not a morbid exercise nor a concession to sensationalism. It is a historical necessity. Understanding how the Third Reich fell is understanding how far fanaticism can go when it finds no institutional, ethical, or human limits. It is understanding how absolute power, sustained by fear and propaganda, inevitably ends in collapse. And it is also a permanent warning. Only by confronting that past with clarity, rigor, and critical memory can we prevent the darkest shadows of the 20th century from being projected onto the future again. Hitler's last secrets, forgotten documents of the Third Reich. The Third Reich has collapsed. Berlin, the former capital of Nazi power, has been transformed into a landscape of utter destruction. What was once the center of a political and military machine that terrorized the entire world is now nothing more than an ocean of ruins, charred buildings, and silent streets. Nothing remains of the city that for 12 years symbolized the domination, propaganda, and totalitarian ambition of Adolf Hitler's regime. In June 1945, after the end of the fighting, the Western forces finally reached Berlin to assume control of their respective occupation zones in accordance with the agreements between the Allies. The city was divided, guarded, and exhausted. Among the countless points of strategic and historical interest, one stands out above all others: the bunker where Hitler spent his final days and ended his life. That place, hidden beneath the former gardens of the Reich Chancellery, embodies the symbolism of the ultimate collapse of the Third Reich. Very soon, the site begins to attract visitors. First, its diplomats, high-ranking officers, and political representatives. Then, soldiers and officials from the American, British, French, and Soviet forces. Even civilians, driven by curiosity and morbid fascination, try to get close. Everyone wants to see with their own eyes the final resting place of the man the Soviets described as the greatest criminal of the century. The bunker becomes an obligatory, almost ritualistic stop for those participating in the occupation of the German capital. For many, it's not just a physical place, but a symbol. The exact spot where a regime that promised to last 1,000 years was extinguished in a mere 12. Walking through those ruins is to confront the utter failure of an ideology built on terror, war, and extermination. Among the numerous visitors was a small detachment of French officers. On the afternoon of November 25, 1945, one of them, Commander Raymond Rose, entered what remained of the Reich Chancellery through the main entrance on Vossstrasse. The building is devastated, walls crumbling, rooms empty, furniture overturned, and clear signs of looting. Nothing remains of the architectural grandeur conceived to glorify the Führer. Rose and his men didn't arrive there by chance. They had prepared carefully for the exploration. Like other officers before them, they hoped to find more than just rubble, documents, plans, material traces that would help them understand the final days of the Nazi regime. The commander descends to the subterranean levels and, with almost meticulous attention, explores the corridors of the former center of power. Later, he will precisely describe his itinerary and draw detailed maps of the site, noting the key points where he made unexpected discoveries. Unbeknownst to them, that small French group is about to make one of the most important discoveries related to Hitler's downfall. Amid the chaos, among abandoned papers and devastated rooms, documents that should never have survived begin to emerge. Files that, against all logic, escaped the total destruction orders issued by the Führer himself in his last hours. That silent tour through the bowels of the Chancellery not only marks a physical exploration of the bunker, but also the beginning of a historical revelation that decades later would shed new light on the last secrets of the man who led Europe to war and the abyss. The expedition has been carefully prepared. Like others before them, the officers hoped to find significant traces of the recent past, perhaps documents forgotten among the building's ruins. Later, Rose recounts his foray into the basement of Hitler's former headquarters in great detail. He draws 3 precise maps of his route, indicating corridors, staircases, and rooms, as well as the exact location where he finds documents belonging to the Führer. Only a few walls and empty rooms remain standing of the Chancellery. The furniture is overturned and signs of looting are evident. The site is open to anyone who wishes to explore it. In a main cavity, barely illuminated by electric lanterns, you must look for a small, hidden door. Beyond it, an 8-step staircase leads to a second, wider staircase, which opens into a large hall supported by square columns. Although located underground, this room boasts a surprisingly elaborate decoration, comparable to that of a ceremonial hall. At the opposite end, shrouded in darkness, stands a heavy metal door adorned with floral motifs sculpted into the wall. Upon passing through it, one descends further down a narrow, straight staircase consisting of exactly 26 steps. What you find at the end is a scene of absolute chaos: overturned tables and chairs, the remains of burnt-out candles, and clear signs of hasty fires. The floor is covered with a vast amount of papers, administrative correspondence, account books, notebooks, and official documents. They are the remnants of a frantic search that lasted for months and ended buried beneath the collapse of the regime. In the most remote room, Commander Rose discovers documents that reveal a crucial fact. Hitler had decided to remain in Berlin regardless of the circumstances, even when defeat was inevitable and events made any hope of salvation impossible. Unbeknownst to them, the French officers had made a discovery of great historical significance. However, the true value of those documents would not be recognized until more than 70 years later. Decades later, a French collector, deeply interested in this dark period of history, acquired the documents belonging to Raymond Rose. At some point, the commander had retrieved the papers from a cupboard, removed them from the bunker, and requested permission to keep them. The authorization was granted, and Rose kept the documents for the rest of his life. It wasn't an act motivated by personal gain or recognition. For him, it was a deeply emotional decision. In a way, he had been a direct witness to and participant in history. Only with the passage of time would the historical magnitude of that material be understood. To fully understand the importance of these documents, it is necessary to go back to Hitler's last days. By mid-April 1945, the Red Army was less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. The remnants of the German forces, around 500,000 soldiers and some 900 tanks, were retreating before the unstoppable Soviet advance. On a front of more than 200 kilometers, the defenses of the Reich were crumbling. Germany was on the verge of total collapse. Berlin was constantly bombarded by Allied bombing raids. Every 10 days, daytime attacks by American aircraft. Every night, harassing British raids. The population lived underground, sheltering in basements and train stations, physically and mentally exhausted. Hitler shared that same exhaustion with the other 3 million inhabitants of the city. Finally, the intensity of the attacks reached a critical point. It was then that Hitler made the final decision to move to the bunker and remain there until the end. For the German population, mired in despair, the wait for the outcome seemed interminable. Radio broadcast the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra's final live performance, Wagner's Götterdämmerung, a choice laden with symbolism for the regime's demise. Hitler locked himself in his underground shelter, located a few hundred meters from the Brandenburg Gate, under the gardens of the Chancellery, in the heart of the government district. From there, he would direct the last and desperate military operations of the Third Reich. The Führer's bunker had been built on 2 levels. The first, in 1936, was located beneath part of the Reich Chancellery. The second, deeper and more reinforced, would become the final stage of one of the most dramatic downfalls in contemporary history. The second level of the bunker was built between 1943 and 1944, when it became clear that the original roof, with a thickness of 1.6 meters, was not enough to withstand the most powerful bombs dropped by the American and British aircraft. The relatively small underground structure sacrificed living space for extreme solidity. It was a colossal block of reinforced concrete designed to ensure that Adolf Hitler could remain in Berlin and direct events from there. He always feared being away from the capital, a concern that intensified after the attempted coup and assassination in July 1944. For Hitler, Berlin had to remain the absolute center of power. Together with Albert Speer, his architect and Minister of Armaments, Hitler oversaw every detail of the design. The bunker was intended to allow him to live there for an extended period, accompanied by his personal guard, completely protected from any air attack. In this section of the complex, he ordered the creation of a space separate from the rest, a small private apartment consisting of 4 rooms. In the other area of the bunker there were more rooms, but without any real privacy. Hitler reserved 3 extremely small rooms for his personal use and an adjoining room for his mistress, Eva Braun. They both shared a tiny bathroom. There was also a small meeting room where twice a day Hitler met with his top advisors to assess the military situation. The bunker was buried about 7 meters underground. Multiple modifications were made to improve the comfort of Hitler and his entourage, but even so, the atmosphere was oppressive. The place was bleak and deeply depressing. Built over the water table of the nearby River Spree, the bunker suffered from constant water leaks. The floor had to be drained continuously and the cold was constant. A mechanical ventilation system ran non-stop. The constant noise of the fan caused headaches and intensified the feeling of confinement. It was, in every sense, a sordid and suffocating environment. Under those conditions, Hitler was not at his best. He issued contradictory orders and his behavior became erratic. His personal physician, Theodor Morell, administered daily injections of glucose and vitamins in addition to a combination of various drugs. The officers who saw him during that period, many of whom later recounted their impressions, were deeply shocked. They shuddered at the memory of his appearance. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. His face was pale, almost white. He looked as if he had suddenly aged between 10 and 15 years. Witnesses were not only dismayed, but also seriously concerned about his mental stability. Hitler was visibly deteriorated and in an advanced stage of Parkinson's disease. He walked hunched over, dragging his feet through the narrow corridors of the shelter, and had almost completely lost control of his left arm, shaken by uncontrollable spasms that he had to hold with his right hand to contain them. Adolf Hitler's physical deterioration was evident to all those around him. The man who had dominated Germany with fiery speeches and theatrical gestures was now a broken figure, prematurely aged, a prisoner of his own body and his obsessions. To keep the bunker running, Hitler relied on a staff of about 30 people. These included personal guards, technicians in charge of ventilation, electricity and generators, radio and telephone operators, as well as messengers who were still trying to maintain some contact with a crumbling outside world. In that underground, claustrophobic and smoke-filled space, the final core of the Third Reich was concentrated. Joseph Goebbels, who had moved his wife and 6 children to the bunker, Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, omnipresent, vigilant and increasingly powerful, and the secretaries, mostly young, who continued to perform their work with discipline until the last days, typing orders, wills and conversations that could no longer change the course of history. Against Hitler's initial wishes, he had always tried to keep her out of the public eye, his partner decided to join him in the bunker. Eva Braun refused to remain safe in Bavaria while he faced his end in Berlin. Among the documents found decades later in a private collection were 2 pieces of exceptional historical value, the last 2 letters written by Eva Braun. The originals, kept hidden from public scrutiny for years, finally came to light, offering an intimate and disturbing look at the regime's final days from a deeply personal perspective. The first of these letters is dated April 19, 1945, and is addressed to her best friend, Herta Schneider, who remained in Bavaria. In it, Eva describes daily life inside the bunker with a striking mix of extreme tension and a kind of forced normality. She recounts how she and the secretaries practiced shooting with pistols every day, not only as training, but also as a form of discipline and psychological escape. She states that they had reached such a level of skill that no man dared to compete with them anymore, a statement that reveals both pride and a need for affirmation in an environment dominated by fear. Eva also recounts that she had spent virtually her entire adult life in air raid shelters, first during the bombings and now in that final confinement. Sleeping had become difficult, almost impossible, amidst the roar of Soviet artillery and the constant tension. Nevertheless, despite everything, she writes that she feels happy to be able to be near Hitler during those crucial moments. That statement, written when Berlin was already practically lost, shows the extent to which her emotional world revolved exclusively around him. At the end of the letter, Eva Braun leaves a phrase that sums up her destiny. She will remain by his side until the end. It is not a political or ideological statement, but a deeply personal one. This testimony starkly reflects the tragedy of Eva Braun, an extremely romantic young woman, much younger than Hitler, who lived for years in the shadows without public recognition and whose greatest anguish throughout the relationship was the constant fear of losing him. That fear accompanied her from the beginning and marked all her decisions, even the most extreme ones. Her presence in the bunker was not the result of coercion, but a conscious choice. Eva Braun decided to share not only Hitler's private life, but also his downfall. That final gesture encapsulates emotional dependence, the idealization of the leader, and the inability to imagine a life outside the orbit of the man to whom she had dedicated her existence. His letter, written with apparent serenity as the world crumbled, not only illuminates the last days in the bunker, but adds a human dimension, tragic and disturbing, to the twilight of the Third Reich. At the beginning of that relationship, she even attempted suicide, an episode that alarmed Hitler and led him to keep her by his side. For Eva, her decision to stay in the bunker was not only an act of loyalty, but also a way to give meaning and legitimacy to a relationship always lived in the shadows, demonstrating that she would be with him until the very end. The letter also provides key information about Adolf Hitler's state of mind on the eve of his 56th birthday. It is particularly revealing because it allows us to perceive the atmosphere inside the bunker. A glimmer of hope is still visible. Eva writes that not a single day went by without people begging her to take refuge at the Berghof in Bavaria, but that until then she had always refused. She acknowledges that all communication was impossible that day, but states that she is deeply convinced that the situation would eventually be resolved favorably, and that Hitler, far from surrendering, seemed to have more hope than ever. However, in the early hours of April 20th at 3 o'clock, a mournful siren broke the silence of Berlin. It was an unknown signal to the population, the announcement that a new and decisive test was about to begin. Red Army tanks had been spotted in the suburbs of the capital. April 20th, 1945, the Führer's last birthday. April 20th thus acquired a crucial symbolic significance. It was Hitler's birthday, and at the same time the day on which Soviet forces began the direct invasion of Berlin. From that moment on, the central question for Hitler was clear: remain in the city or flee. With the encirclement tightening and the last defensive lines collapsing, the threat of being completely surrounded became real and immediate. Should he escape or resist to the end? At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Hitler made his last public appearance. At the top of the bunker steps in the Reich Chancellery gardens, he received birthday greetings from an SS delegation. In particular, he also greeted a group of members of the Hitler Youth, the regime's youngest reservists, teenagers who were being sent to the front to defend Berlin and, in many cases, die in anti-tank units. Hitler wanted to pay homage to the bravest among them. His left arm trembled visibly as he shook hands with each young man. He even went so far as to stroke the cheek of some of those boys whom, without saying so, he was bidding farewell and sending to almost certain death. The youngest of those boys was barely 11 years old, the age at which a child normally transitions from primary to secondary school. He was small, no more than 4 feet 7 inches tall, and wore the uniform of the Hitler Youth. That detail alone reflected the extent to which the regime was willing to sacrifice even the youngest in its desperate attempt to defend Berlin. At 4 in the afternoon, shortly before the usual military briefing, the Führer received birthday greetings from the regime's top officials. Heinrich Himmler, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Martin Bormann, Karl Dönitz, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Albert Speer and Hermann Göring were all present. Everyone came to pay their respects, but Hitler accepted the congratulations with obvious reluctance. It was clear he had no desire to celebrate. April 20th, 1945 was probably one of the most grotesque and surreal birthday celebrations imaginable. That same morning, Göring had ordered the destruction of his magnificent Karinhall castle to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. His treasures, works of art, photographs, and personal belongings were loaded onto a Luftwaffe convoy of trucks and sent south. Shortly afterward, Göring appeared in Berlin alongside Keitel and the rest of the Nazi leadership. Many of them were desperate for permission to leave the city, aware that Berlin was doomed. They tried to persuade Hitler to leave, not so much to save him, but to receive authorization to flee themselves. That same day, his partner, Eva Braun, gave him a gift, a signed and dedicated photograph. The gift was found decades later and is an exceptional piece, never before shown to the public, with a unique history. For years after the war ended, the photograph and its frame remained in the possession of Eva's sister, Gretel. Only when the Braun family parted with it did a discerning collector realize its true value. This dedication represents the only material proof of Eva Braun's emotional bond with Hitler, since all her personal correspondence was destroyed in the final days of the conflict. Eva gave him a silver-framed photograph of herself with a monogram designed by Albert Speer. The inscription read, "To my Führer, from your faithful Eva." The choice of words is revealing. Eva does not use his name as her partner, but rather the term "my Führer," giving the gesture a political dimension, and she underscores her loyalty by using the word faithful. At a time when almost everyone was beginning to think about their own survival, Eva wanted to make clear her absolute loyalty to Hitler and her decision to remain by his side. Hitler accepted the gift from the woman who had returned to his side in his darkest hours. For years, he had kept their relationship a state secret. He firmly believed that the leader of the German people could not afford to take a wife, as that would cause frustration among the women who identified with him, and he felt that his role demanded personal sacrifice on behalf of the nation. Hitler also refused to seek refuge in the Alps, where elite troops were supposedly located. Many of his collaborators urged him to move to Bavaria, to the so-called Alpine Fortress, a region around Obersalzberg where, according to German propaganda, bunkers and fortifications had been built from which the most fanatical elements of the SS could resist for a long time. In reality, that Alpine refuge never existed. It was a propaganda fabrication. However, the deception worked. Allied Commander Eisenhower believed the threat, which decisively influenced Allied military strategy. A large part of the American forces was diverted south toward Munich and the Alps, instead of advancing directly east. Hitler knew perfectly well that there was no Alpine hideout. He was aware that fleeing would only delay the inevitable. Therefore, he made his final decision, to die in Berlin in an apocalyptic scene worthy of a Wagnerian tragedy, surrounded by his last troops and the remnants of a regime that was crumbling around him. The idea had been suggested by Albert Speer. Berlin's Götterdämmerung, a grandiose and almost cinematic finale, would have unparalleled dramatic force. In Berchtesgaden, on the other hand, nothing would have that same symbolic impact. Against the advice of all his collaborators and his inner circle, Adolf Hitler made his final decision. He would remain in Berlin. Victory or death, his last battle would be fought in the capital of the Reich. The birthday celebration ended that very night amid the roar of the last major Allied air raid on Berlin. And in the early hours of April 21st, something unprecedented happened. For the first time since the start of the war, Soviet artillery shells began to rain directly down on the city. Berlin was entering a phase for which no one was prepared, the battle for its own heart. Hitler seemed determined to replicate Stalingrad. Both he and Joseph Goebbels, whom he saw almost every night, believed that a major urban battle could be a turning point. On the other side, Joseph Stalin shared a similar logic. Taking Berlin had incalculable symbolic value. Whoever conquered the German capital would be remembered for posterity as the true victor over the Third Reich. After the initial bombardment, the various units of the Red Army began to close the encirclement. About 10 kilometers from the center, the first Soviet soldiers were already penetrating the German capital. Stalin had designated the Reichstag as a priority target, the ultimate symbol of Nazi defeat. At that time, Hitler was not yet the primary Soviet concern. Intelligence services were unaware of his whereabouts and did not rule out the possibility that he had fled. In reality, Hitler was still there, a few meters underground, holed up in the bunker, desperately trying to organize a counter-offensive. However, the situation was changing by the hour. The military meetings were becoming increasingly detached from reality. Hitler once again bent over maps, pointing to supposed armies and divisions that, in fact, barely existed. Many of these units were reduced to small groups of poorly armed men. Even so, from his underground hideout, Hitler believed he had 3 army corps in the vicinity of Berlin. General Busse's 9th Army to the southeast, Steiner's unit to the north, and the 12th Army to the southwest of the city. None of them had enough armored vehicles or anti-tank weapons. They were mostly made up of very young soldiers, motivated and willing to fight to the end, but without the necessary equipment to face the Red Army. The idea that the 12th Army could join the 9th and launch a coordinated counterattack from the east was once again a typical Hitler fantasy. Even so, he continued issuing orders as if those forces could execute concentric maneuvers capable of halting the Soviet advance. No counteroffensive worked. German troops were retreating on all fronts. Hitler couldn't understand why, according to the maps, the units were advancing, but in reality they weren't making any progress. That day, for the first time in a long time, he completely lost control of his surroundings. He burst into shouts, proclaiming, "I give up, all is lost. This is the end." At that moment, those around him understood that there was no longer any possible solution, no alternative plan, and no hope whatsoever. Eva Braun fully shared that despair. She expressed it in an exceptional document, revealed for the first time, her last letter, written on April 22nd and addressed to her closest friend, Hertha Schneider. "These will probably be my last lines and my last sign of life," she wrote. She confessed that she didn't dare write to her sister Gretel and asked that the news be delivered to her discreetly. In the letter, Eva explained clearly that they had both decided to commit suicide, although Hitler had not yet made that decision public to those around him. She detailed her feelings, her personal suffering because of the Führer, and his inability to understand how everything could end that way. She also expressed her conviction that the end was near and stated that Hitler would die as he had lived. Eva asked her friend to keep the letter safe until its destination was known and entrusted her with one last mission: to distribute her jewels according to her wishes. She had left precise instructions and a detailed will, and she wanted every detail to be followed. That same day, the letter, the will, and the jewels were sent to Bavaria. Meanwhile, on the afternoon of April 22nd, Hitler made a significant statement to members of his staff, including a representative of Hermann Göring. He announced that he was prepared to relinquish control. "I am handing over the reins. It is all over. My successor can take over. Göring can do it." It was a tacit confession of defeat, uttered in the very heart of the bunker as Berlin crumbled around him. In 1939 and again in 1941, Hermann Göring had been designated by decree as Adolf Hitler's potential successor. These provisions, however, were not automatic. To take full effect, they required the Führer's express ratification, a formality that, in the context of the Reich's collapse, acquired decisive weight. In the last days of April 1945, the words spoken by Hitler in the bunker, confused, ambiguous and full of resignation, were transmitted to Göring, who was taking refuge in Bavaria along with part of his entourage and one of his most influential advisors, Hans Lammers. Cautious by temperament and aware of the political danger that any misstep implied, Göring hesitated immediately. The question arose as to whether the decrees of 1939 and 1941 were still legally valid, or whether Hitler had signed a new one that annulled them. Lammers was adamant. If a subsequent decree existed, he would have known about it. That response led Göring to conclude that his designation as successor remained legally valid. Even so, he hesitated. He was torn between the temptation to assume power in the twilight of the regime and the fear of committing a historical error that would place him, in the eyes of Hitler and the party, in the position of a traitor. Finally, he opted for prudence and decided not to act immediately, postponing any final decision until the next day. Meanwhile, Berlin continued to be relentlessly bombarded. Soviet artillery and bombing reduced the city to a landscape of smoldering ruins. In that context, in the early hours of April 23rd, taking extreme risks, Albert Speer returned to the besieged capital and managed to gain access to the bunker. His arrival was interpreted by Eva Braun as a ray of hope. He believed that Speer, one of the few people Hitler still listened to, could convince him to leave Berlin and seek refuge. But that expectation proved illusory. Hitler received Speer with a distant, almost mechanical coldness, although he perfectly understood the meaning of his visit. He was not naive. He clearly saw that many of those who still remained around him were preparing their escape or trying to save themselves individually. Speer had come in part to say goodbye to the man he had admired for years, but also to confess an act of serious disobedience. He admitted that he had not carried out one of the Führer's most extreme orders, the total destruction of the Reich's infrastructure before the arrival of the Red Army and the Western Allies, a scorched earth policy that would have condemned the German population to absolute collapse. Speer expected a violent reaction, an outburst of anger, a fierce rebuke, or even an arrest warrant. None of that happened. Hitler barely responded, displaying a disconcerting indifference. That lack of reaction deeply hurt Speer, who had confessed what in other times would have been considered an act of high treason. However, Hitler let him go without consequence. In that final moment, one could sense the echo of a unique relationship between them. Perhaps Hitler saw in Speer an almost filial figure, the intellectual and artistic son he never had. Others, for far lesser offences, had been executed without mercy. Here, however, only silence remained, a silence that symbolized both Hitler's personal exhaustion and the final decay of the power he had wielded for more than a decade. That same afternoon, April 23, 1945, Göring finally made his decision. At 5:43 p.m., he sent a telegram to Hitler asking whether, in accordance with his decision to remain fighting in Berlin, he should assume the leadership of the Reich with full powers both domestically and internationally. In reality, Göring had already initiated discreet contacts in the hope of opening peace negotiations. He wanted to present himself as the man who would end the war. In a second message, he stated that if he did not receive a response from Hitler before 10 o'clock at night, he would interpret the silence as a sign that the Führer was no longer fit to govern, and that he should assume the position of Chancellor. These telegrams, along with all subsequent correspondence, are part of a set of 13 original documents discovered in the bunker by Commander Raymond Rose. Thanks to them, it is now possible to accurately reconstruct the final tense and decisive exchange between Hitler and Göring. Göring also sent another message to Joachim von Ribbentrop and probably to Wilhelm Keitel as well, inviting them to join him in Berchtesgaden if Hitler did not reply. For Göring, it wasn't a matter of disloyalty. He believed he was reacting to a situation in which Hitler could no longer govern. In his mind, his leadership would only be temporary. However, that second message proved fatal. When it reached Hitler, he was with Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, sworn enemies of Göring. Bormann presented the telegram as outright treason. Hitler, already convinced that the German defeat was due to internal conspiracies, interpreted it in the worst possible way. That same afternoon, Hitler responded with a stern and categorical message. He stated that the succession decree would only be valid if he himself ratified it, and made it clear that he was not willing to be deprived of his freedom of action. Finally, he expressly forbade Göring from undertaking any political or military initiative. The message was personally signed by Adolf Hitler. Following the recommendation of his chief of staff, Martin Bormann, Hitler ordered the arrest of Hermann Göring. The fall of the heir to the Reich. At 0056 on April 24th, Göring responded with a lengthy telegram in which he categorically denied any disloyal intent. He asserted that he had not acted while awaiting a reply, reiterated his readiness to serve the Führer, and concluded with a pledge of personal loyalty, imploring that no order be given for his arrest and offering his word of honor that he had strictly obeyed all instructions received. Hours later, in the early morning of April 24th, Hitler dictated another telegram, this time unequivocal. In it, he accused Göring of betraying the national cause and asserted that such conduct constituted high treason, punishable by death. However, citing past service, he offered her a way out, resigned from all his positions, claiming a serious illness. He demanded an immediate, unambiguous response. Göring accepted. Within minutes, he responded affirmatively and resigned from all his duties for health reasons. That gesture sealed Bormann's definitive rise, a shadowy figure who, since Rudolf Hess's flight to Great Britain in 1941, had amassed considerable power as Hitler's personal secretary. Driven by a deep resentment towards certain leaders of the regime, Bormann seized upon Göring's downfall to consolidate his control. But he was not content with his political humiliation. Without informing Adolf Hitler, Martin Bormann used his own communications center inside the bunker to issue a secret order to the officer in charge of guarding Hermann Göring. The instruction was clear and brutal. Göring was to be executed once Berlin fell. That order, however, was never carried out. The SS major assigned to execute it decided to ignore it when the city was finally captured. He was convinced that Hitler would no longer be alive to demand accountability and that a belated assassination would lack any practical or political sense. While these maneuvers were unfolding behind his back, Hitler continued to humiliate and degrade Göring. On April 25th, he dictated his final message against him, addressed to his personal assistant. In that text, he accused him of disloyalty to the German people, the Führer and the state itself, and ordered his immediate expulsion from the National Socialist Party. The document, written in implacable terms, once again bore Hitler's personal signature, thus sealing the definitive downfall of one of the most powerful men in the Reich. That same day, Hitler gave another order revealing of his mental state and his obsession with controlling the historical narrative, the total destruction of his private archives. Many of those documents disappeared forever, but in the chaos of the last few days, some survived almost miraculously. Hitler ordered the burning of his personal correspondence, including exchanges with foreign heads of state, as well as military memoranda and strategic notes. He also sent his personal aide, Julius Schaub, out of the bunker with the mission of destroying archives kept in Munich and Berchtesgaden, a task that Schaub carried out with absolute loyalty. Like Joseph Goebbels, Hitler was deeply concerned about his posthumous legacy. Both knew the Reich was doomed, but tried until the very end to control how it would be remembered. They didn't want to leave any traces that could be used to reconstruct decisions, responsibilities, or contradictions. For them, the destruction of documents was a final act of power. Meanwhile, military reality was violently imposing itself. Hour after hour, the Soviet troops advanced inexorably. Artillery shells rained down relentlessly on the Chancellery gardens directly above the bunker. Explosions shook the underground walls, dust rained from the ceiling, and the air became unbreathable. The outside world was literally collapsing around them. A series of typed documents transcribing private conversations between Hitler and Goebbels offer a glimpse into the Führer's final military ambitions. These texts were preserved by Heinz Lorenz, head of the bunker's press service, and were not made public until decades later. In them, Hitler insists that a victory in Berlin is still possible, not a strategic victory but a moral one. According to his reasoning, even a symbolic success would suffice to buy time, preserve appearances, and demonstrate to the world that the Reich was still capable of resisting. Hitler was convinced that only in Berlin could this effect be achieved. He believed that by concentrating international attention there, any heroic resistance would have a global impact. In his mind, halting even momentarily, the Bolshevik colossus would allow him to rewrite the end of the war. It was a logic completely disconnected from military reality, but consistent with his way of thinking, a mixture of fatalism, propaganda, and self-deception. These documents reveal a Hitler trapped in his own narrative, unable to accept defeat, clinging to the idea that history could still grant him one last gesture of greatness. Beneath the ruins of Berlin, as the Reich crumbled beyond recognition, the Führer continued to fight not for victory, but for the meaning of his own downfall. He believed that only there, under the global gaze, could he halt the Bolshevik colossus and demonstrate that the German party and state were still capable of resistance. As Soviet armies advanced in concentric circles toward the Reichstag and the Chancellery, the situation for civilians became desperate. Basements were overcrowded without water or communication, and food shortages reached dramatic levels. When a horse was shot down in the street, people would run under fire to cut off a piece of meat and survive. In the midst of that barrage of artillery fire, an extraordinary event occurred. On April 27th, a Luftwaffe pilot managed to land her plane near Hitler's bunker. It was Hannah Reich, who had arrived with her companion, General Ritter von Greim, who was seriously wounded. Both went down to the bunker, with von Greim being carried on a stretcher to see the Führer urgently. Ritter von Greim had been wounded in the foot as they landed under enemy fire. Why had she come? Hannah Reich had a clear mission, to try to convince Adolf Hitler to leave the bunker and escape, perhaps to Berchtesgaden. But there was nothing to be done. Hitler flatly refused. In those final days, he had begun distributing cyanide capsules among the members of his entourage. He personally handed one to Hannah Reich, a symbolic gesture she interpreted as an honor, a reward for her daring feat. At the same time, Hitler promoted von Greim, appointing him commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe in place of Hermann Göring. Then they left just as they had arrived, taking off under a rain of Soviet fire, and against all odds they managed to escape unharmed. Meanwhile, another high-ranking Nazi official was working behind the scenes. Heinrich Himmler had left Berlin shortly after Hitler's birthday. As Minister of the Interior and head of the SS, he attempted to seize the initiative by offering the Allies Germany's unconditional surrender. Confident in his own abilities, he believed he could take control of the Reich. But on April 28th, the Allies openly ridiculed his attempt in the press. Dwight D. Eisenhower flatly rejected any negotiations, and his statement was published in the Western media. When Hitler found out, he flew into a rage. The man who had been one of his closest collaborators and the principal architect of the final solution was immediately stripped of all his posts. This final betrayal left him psychologically devastated. Still in Berlin, but outside the bunker, was SS General Hermann Fegelein, the liaison officer between Himmler and Hitler. In the climate of paranoia and vengeance that gripped the bunker, the suspicion that Fegelein was trying to escape and might be involved in Himmler's betrayal was enough to seal his fate. Hitler decided he should be shot. Fegelein was also Eva Braun's brother-in-law. He was married to her sister Gretel, and Hitler himself had attended the wedding. Even so, Eva Braun made no attempt to intercede for his life. She was horrified at the idea of anyone abandoning the Führer at such a crucial moment. To her, fleeing was an unforgivable act of cowardice. Added to this was Fegelein's personal betrayal of his sister, which eliminated any trace of compassion. Psychologically, Hitler was on the verge of collapse. In a final conversation with Joseph Goebbels, typed up and preserved by the bunker's press chief Heinz Lorenz, they both analyzed the military situation with a mixture of resignation and fantasy. Adolf Hitler then expressed his last military hope that General Walter Wenck's 12th Army would manage to break through to Berlin and shatter the Soviet encirclement. Exhausted, he stated that he would try to rest a little and gave an order revealing of his mental state that he should only be woken up if a Soviet tank approached the bunker. He asserted that even if there were a real chance of survival, he would not take it. For him, the principle was unwavering: a captain does not abandon a sinking ship. Reality, however, was very different from his illusions. Wenck's army did not advance on Berlin. On the contrary, after a brief and chaotic engagement, it was forced to retreat in complete disarray. The German forces were exhausted, outnumbered, and had no real room to maneuver. In that context, rumors and false reports became the last psychological refuge for both civilians and defenders of the city. On April 28th, leaflets fell on Berlin announcing, in a completely false manner, the imminent arrival of a German army from the southwest to break the Soviet encirclement. That news, fabricated or repeated without verification, spread rapidly. None of it was true. Wenck's army was already being repelled in the vicinity of Potsdam and would never reach the capital. Even so, the population clung to that collective lie, because believing it was less unbearable than accepting the end. As the hours passed, hope slowly disintegrated. It gave way to apathy, fear, and finally a primal and desperate desire to live a little longer, one more hour, maybe two, maybe three. Berlin was no longer thinking about victory or even defeat, but about simple survival. In the early hours of April 29, 1945, at 1 o'clock, Hitler married Eva Braun, his romantic partner for 13 years. The only witnesses were Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and a civil registrar. A duly certified marriage certificate was signed amidst the explosions that rocked the city. Hitler left a written record stating that the ceremony had been held at Eva Braun's express request. It was a profoundly surreal act, consummated as the Third Reich was irrevocably collapsing around him. Everything indicates that the decision to marry was deeply influenced by the climate of betrayal that Hitler believed he perceived in his inner circle. Göring, Himmler, high-ranking party, and army officials. In his mind, they had all failed or conspired. Eva Braun, on the other hand, had remained by his side until the end, consciously choosing to share his fate. The marriage was, at the same time, a personal reward, a symbolic gesture, and a silent admission that the game was over. For years, Hitler had proclaimed that his only wife was Germany, and in the name of that idea he had refused to marry. That he broke that principle in the last hours of his life was not a minor contradiction. It was the definitive confirmation that he understood that there was no longer a Reich, nor a future, nor any possible redemption. The marriage sealed not only a personal union but also the intimate acknowledgement of utter defeat. While one after another his collaborators abandoned him or conspired against him, Eva had willingly returned to die by his side. Hitler felt that such absolute loyalty deserved to be rewarded. He also knew that Eva's greatest desire was to finally become Frau Hitler. But the marriage also had a deeper meaning. It was the definitive confirmation that Hitler had understood that it was all over. During his years in power, his motto had been clear: "I have only one wife, Germany." In the name of that principle, he had always refused to marry. To renounce it now was tantamount to accepting the end. After toasting with a glass of sparkling wine alongside Eva Braun and the small circle of loyalists who still remained in the bunker, Hitler retired to the meeting room. There he summoned his secretary, Traudl Juncker, and swiftly dictated his personal and political testament. He did not hesitate, he did not revise, he did not reflect. The document starkly revealed that he had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. The same obsessions remained intact, especially his radical anti-Semitism. In his view, he had never made mistakes. The defeat could only be explained by betrayal. He presented himself as a victim of what he called the two faces of international Jewry, Bolshevism in the East and international finance in the West. While this final act was taking place underground, the Red Army launched its final offensive on Berlin. Soviet troops stopped about 500 meters from the bunker without even knowing that Hitler was there. In fact, Soviet commanders believed that the top Nazi leaders were taking refuge in the Reichstag, which was their symbolic objective. They expected to find the Reich government there. They never imagined that Hitler was hiding beneath the Chancellery. He could have remained alive for several more days without anyone noticing. In the early hours of April 30th at 3 o'clock, Hitler dictated his personal will. In it, he declared, "My wife and I have chosen death to escape the shame of deposition or surrender. Our wish is to be cremated immediately at the place where we die." Hitler was unwilling to have his corpse displayed as a symbol of defeat or a Soviet trophy. He feared ending up like Benito Mussolini, whose body had been publicly hanged in Italy. Soviet archives contain documents that demonstrate the extent to which that image obsessed him. That is why he demanded that his body and Eva Braun's be completely destroyed. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, after ordering the poisoning of his dog Blondie, Hitler said goodbye to his staff. He advised his assistants to try to flee west and urged his officers to keep fighting. Shortly after 3 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their rooms. There they ended their lives. Their bodies were immediately taken to the gardens of the Chancellery and burned near one of the bunker's exits. The next day, May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda committed suicide after poisoning their 6 children. The war that Hitler had begun ended in the same way, marked by his personal and total destruction. For posterity, he chose a grandiose end, intertwined with the Battle of Berlin. He only accepted death when all was lost. 48 hours later, on May 2nd, 1945, Soviet troops entered the bunker at 3 in the afternoon. Military operations continued until the German surrender, signed on May 7th and 8th in Reims and Berlin. The Nazi regime formally survived until May 23rd. With Hitler's disappearance, the pressure evaporated and the system collapsed rapidly. But one question remained: what happened to Hitler's body? It was Soviet counterintelligence agents who located the site, covered with earth. Beneath it, they found the charred remains of Hitler and Eva Braun. Although they had been burned, they were not completely destroyed. The bodies were placed in wooden boxes and sent for forensic analysis. The identification was made using dental records. Hitler had a very distinctive dental bridge, specially made of gold. He hated going to the dentist, and that unique prosthesis became the definitive proof of his death. Once the remains were formally identified by Soviet counterintelligence services, another story began, the story of the myth. Joseph Stalin knew for certain that Adolf Hitler was dead. However, he made a deliberate decision not to inform even Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the victorious commander of the Battle of Berlin. When Zhukov, who had become the symbol of the Soviet victory, appeared before the international press after the capture of the Reichstag, he uttered a phrase that would go around the world. "We have not identified Hitler's body. He could have fled Berlin at the last moment. That statement made no sense from a military or logistical standpoint. Stalin knew perfectly well that Hitler had not escaped, and yet he allowed that version to be disseminated. The effect was immediate and lasting. The seed of doubt was sown. What if Hitler wasn't dead? What if he had managed to escape? That insinuation became the starting point for decades of speculation. For at least 30 years, Stalin's calculated silence fueled a vast body of pseudo-historical literature, sensationalist books, purported eyewitness accounts, and reports of sightings around the world, especially in Latin America. Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile became recurring settings for delusional theories about the supposed survival of the Führer. Why did Stalin maintain that silence? It wasn't a mistake or a casual omission. It was a strategy. Stalin possessed the information but decided not to reveal it because it was useful to him. He used it as a propaganda weapon in the nascent context of the Cold War. The suggestion that Hitler might have survived served to reinforce a key narrative, that the Soviet Union was the only truly anti-fascist power in the world, while the West, especially the United States, might be protecting or covering up for former Nazi criminals. The doubt was not seeking historical truth but political advantage. Meanwhile, the physical location where it all ended was also condemned to oblivion. The Führer's bunker was neither transformed into a shrine nor a memorial. On the contrary, that place was deliberately erased from the landscape and from visible memory. After the war, much of the bunker's structure was destroyed, blown up, or sealed by the Soviet authorities, who had no interest in turning it into a pilgrimage site. Over the years, the former gardens of the Reich Chancellery, beneath which lay the underground complex where Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun died, were covered by East German apartment buildings and an ordinary bland parking lot with no historical markings or references. The space was normalized, almost banalized, as if history could be diluted under the weight of everyday life. It was not until after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 that the West understood the extent to which that place had been symbolically neutralized. For decades, there was no sign, monument, or plaque indicating that the last days of the Third Reich had been lived there. The silence was not accidental. It responded to a conscious desire to avoid any form of worship, nostalgia, or fetishization of Nazism. Only 70 years later, a historical association in Berlin installed discrete information panels that explain rigorously and without any glorification what happened in that underground space. There are no statues, no exalted names, only context, dates, and facts. To this day, Russian authorities have not offered a completely transparent and definitive explanation about the final destination of Hitler and Eva Braun's remains. It is known that the bodies were identified through forensic tests, especially through dental records, and that they were subsequently moved on several occasions by the Soviet services. However, some of the official documentation remains inaccessible, and the administrative mystery persists. Even so, the historical and scientific evidence about his death in Berlin is conclusive and leaves no reasonable room for alternative theories. In contrast to that official silence, the historical documents discovered by Commander Raymond Rose and later preserved by collector Bruno Ledoux have finally come to light. Letters, telegrams, signed orders, and original documents that remained scattered or hidden for decades now allow us to reconstruct with greater accuracy Hitler's last political and personal days. These authentic and verifiable documents provide key details about the regime's final decisions, internal power struggles, and the Führer's psychological collapse. These files do not change the outcome of the story, but they do fill in its grey areas. They reveal a man trapped in his obsessions, unable to assume any responsibility for the catastrophe he had caused, clinging until the last moment to the idea of betrayal and ideological delusion. They allow us to understand not only how Hitler died, but how he thought in his final hours, how he made his final decisions, and how the greatest criminal of the 20th century sank without any possible redemption, along with the regime he himself created. The final collapse of the Third Reich. The end of the Third Reich was not only the military collapse of a defeated state, but the moral, political, and human collapse of an ideology built on hatred, violence, and the systematic denial of reality. Berlin in 1945 does not only represent a defeated city, it is the stage where all the contradictions of the Nazi regime converge, all its final lies and all its internal betrayals. In that landscape of ruins, hunger and fear, a system that had promised eternal greatness and only left destruction is extinguished. At the heart of that collapse, trapped under tons of concrete, Adolf Hitler lived his last days isolated, obsessed and clinging to military fantasies that no longer existed. As the Red Army advanced street by street, the Führer continued to speak of moral victories, imaginary armies, and a historical destiny that absolved him of all guilt. Unable to acknowledge his own mistakes, he explained the defeat solely through betrayal, by his generals, by his closest collaborators, and once again by the ideological enemies who had dominated his thinking for decades. The internal dynamics of the bunker starkly reflect the decay of Nazi power. Key figures such as Göring and Himmler, former pillars of the regime, tried to save themselves by negotiating or maneuvering in the shadows. Martin Bormann, from his bureaucratic position, took advantage of the chaos to settle scores and accumulate power. Joseph Goebbels, loyal to the end, chose suicide and the murder of his own children rather than accept a world without National Socialism. None of them truly escaped. They were all trapped in the destructive logic they themselves had fueled. Hitler's marriage to Eva Braun, celebrated in the midst of the siege, sums up the profoundly surreal nature of those final days. It was not a romantic act, but a symbolic one, a belated reward, a private farewell, and at the same time a silent admission that it was all over. With that gesture, Hitler broke one of his personal dogmas, "I only have one wife, Germany," and confirmed that he no longer thought about the future, but only about staging his end. The wording of his political testament reinforces that idea. Even on the brink of death, Hitler did not change his ways. He showed no remorse, no learning, no reflection. He repeated the same obsessions, the same accusations, and the same paranoid view of the world. His suicide was not an act of atonement, but of escape, a way to avoid capture, trial, and historical responsibility. He feared becoming a trophy like Mussolini, and so he ordered the destruction of his body, trying to control even his posthumous image. After his death, silence, misinformation, and manipulation prolonged the shadow of Nazism for decades. Stalin's decision to initially conceal the discovery of the body-fueled rumors, myths, and conspiracy theories that diverted attention from the essential issue. There was no real mystery about Hitler's fate. What there was a political exploitation of doubt, especially in the context of the Cold War. The story was distorted not due to a lack of evidence, but due to power interests. The fate of the bunker is equally revealing. It was not transformed into a sanctuary, nor into a place of pilgrimage, nor into a memorial destined for the nostalgia of extremism. On the contrary, it was deliberately erased from the cityscape, buried under residential buildings and a common parking lot. This decision was not accidental. It reflected a political and moral will to cut off any form of glorification. Germany and Europe chose to confront that past not through veneration, but through historical pedagogy, not with grandiose monuments, but with accurate, sober, and contextualized information. To remember without glorifying, to explain without mythologizing, to point out the place, but to strip it of any symbolic aura. The documents recovered decades later, personal letters, encrypted telegrams, orders signed in the final days, do not rewrite history, but they complete it. They allow us to closely observe the psychological collapse of Adolf Hitler, the internal struggles of a decaying regime, and the final mechanics of a power that ended up devouring itself. Far from fueling conspiracy theories or romantic tales, these files dismantle any attempt at artificial mystery. They reveal a man trapped in his own dogma, unable to recognize failure, obsessed to the end with the idea of betrayal, and oblivious to the suffering caused by his decisions. In that underground, surrounded by unreal maps and impossible orders, the myth crumbled. There was no greatness, no epic, no redemption, only isolation, denial, and ruin. The bunker became the perfect stage for collapse, a closed, dark space with no horizon, where absolute power ended up reduced to murmurs, hasty documents, and belated decisions. There died not only a man, but also the illusion of total control that had sustained the regime for years. In the end, the story of the bunker is not only the chronicle of a death, but of an absolute failure. The failure of an ideology that promised order and produced barbarism. The failure of a leadership that proclaimed itself infallible and ended up hidden underground. The failure of a regime that aspired to last 1,000 years and did not even outlive its own creator. Everything that had been presented as strength ended up revealing itself as extreme fragility. Remembering these events is not a morbid exercise nor a concession to sensationalism. It is a historical necessity. Understanding how the Third Reich fell is understanding how far fanaticism can go when it finds no institutional, ethical, or human limits. It is understanding how absolute power, sustained by fear and propaganda, inevitably ends in collapse. And it is also a permanent warning. Only by confronting that past with clarity, rigor, and critical memory can we prevent the darkest shadows of the 20th century from being projected onto the future again.